Good morning, darlings. Okay, this one is a bit late and yeah, sorry for that. So today we're going to look at post-colonial ways of reading. This is section 4 in your critical anthology. If you hear a weird noise in a minute, it is the dog. Please ignore him. Lord knows I do. So post-colonial ways of reading them. This can be quite confusing because we're not entirely sure. There's a lot of question about what constitutes post-colonialist writing, post-colonialism. It's relatively new. It's less than 30 years old, 30 years at the most, as its own unique category. And so it's still it's in the process of being developed and consolidated and solidified. So let's start with the start of the anthology, and we'll walk through this. And I've got 2 books and extra stuff to read to you as well that isn't in your critical anthology, but again, like before, you can pause, you can take notes. Somebody told me that I speak really quickly in these, so sorry for that, but it's just because my brain moves really quickly, honest, because I'm really smart. Yeah, okay, right, post-colonial ways of reading them. So it says in this section, let me make this a little bit bigger. Bigger is always better. Wage packets, chocolate bars, holiday length, stuff like that, Post-colonial ways of reading then, section 4. In this section, you will see writers considering the idea that the established literature of Europe and North America has traditionally ignored or marginalized the experiences of non-Western peoples and cultures, seeing them as other, different, and invariably lesser. So I'm sure you guys have heard of the canon, capital T, capital C. It's things like your Shakespeare, your Dickens, Brontes. There are a couple of American authors in there. This is usually considered as the pinnacle of decent quality literature, who happen to be from Europe and North America. It's very westernized, okay? And so post-colonialism deals with writers from elsewhere, from outside this area, who are just as good. So if you have done psychology, you might then, if you see these words other, different, and invariably lesser, you might automatically have the words bias and othering in your head. If you don't know what these 2 words mean, go and look them up. It's good for you to do some research on your own. So, to many readers, such texts are either consciously or unconsciously racist. Some writers here focus the perspectives of those affected by colonization or imperialism, that's having an empire, either because they have experienced it themselves or via studying literature that describes it or is a product of it. So you don't theoretically have to be from a former colony to be writing about their struggles, their experiences, and life in a colony, and then being a member of a society after being a colony. Okay, so this is where a lot of people get confused, because they think, oh, you must be a previous colony, but you don't have to be, as long as it's done well and it's been researched and it's done thoroughly. You can be from somewhere else and yet still do that tale, that story, that culture, that piece of text, that work, that literary work, some justice. Okay, right. I am trying to slow down how quickly I speak, so if at any point I am sounding like I'm on fast forward, I'm really sorry, but I think YouTube does that thing where you can slow it down, but I'm not sure if that works for this. So, post-colonial critics, like Marxist and feminist critics, are interested in issues of power, dominance and control, and also in freedom and empowerment. They too are keen to explore how different groups of people are represented in literary texts, whose voices are heard, and what attitudes and values the texts seem to embody and support. Writers taking this theoretical position also focus on the complex relationships between the colonizers and the colonized, and on the language that is used to represent these relationships. So, I've got a book here called Beginning Postcolonialism by John McLeod, L-E-O-D, M-C-L-E-O-D, and it's a great book. And I know I say this all the time, but if you haven't read it, you should. It's really interesting. If this is the sort of thing that really interests you, if this area, if you've thought, oh yes, I'm reading a book and I'd really like to learn more, then this book is a great book that helps you understand the layers and layers and layers of complexity that come with post-colonialism. Okay, so essentially then, this chapter, it says reading colonial discourses, and I'd like to read you just a small section, and I promise it is tiny. It says, colonialism was certainly dependent upon the use of force and physical coercion, but it could not occur without the existence of a set of beliefs that are held to justify the possession and continuing occupation of other people's lands. This is essentially what colonizers did, okay? So they went, oh, you've got something we want. We've got a flag. We're going to come and invade you. We're going to put a flag in the ground and say, oh, you belong to us now. If you haven't watched Eddie Izzard, his sketch on this, you should. It's funny, but it's true. Anyway, back to the book. It says, these beliefs are encoded into the language which the colonizers speak and to which the colonized peoples are subjected. So guys, you've seen this. Checking out my history in your GCSE poetry anthology was written in English but with an accent. But it wasn't written in any sort of native language that person, the speaker of the poem, may have had they not been colonized. Does that make sense? English to them has been something forced upon them. And yes, it's written in an accent, but essentially it's still a recognizable dialect. It's still a recognizable form of English. Okay, so this is, you sort of have some experience with this already at GCSE. Now what you need to do at A-level is deepen that knowledge a little bit. Okay, right, we'll come back to that book later. I've got 2 books on the go, so if I pause at any point and sound like I don't know what I'm doing, I'm just trying to find the places. I have used sticky tabs, but, you know, directions, it's not a great thing. Right, so, okay. It then says, an introduction to post-colonialism, post-colonial theory, and post-colonial literature. This is from an introduction to post-colonialism, post-colonial theory, and post-colonial literature by C.J. Ruffner Greenison. I hope I'm saying that properly. So it says, where does it come from? Post-colonial literature comes from Britain's former colonies in the Caribbean, Africa, and India. Many post-colonial writers write in English, like we've just said with checking out my history, and focus on common themes such as the struggle for independence, emigration, national identity, allegiance, and childhood. And all of those things you were introduced to in that one poem. I am going to reference this quite a lot because it's a great poem and there are layers of subtext. Okay, right, so we'll scroll down a little bit and we'll have, oh, no, too far, right. Post-colonial theory. Post-colonial theory is a literary theory or critical approach that deals with literature produced in countries that were once or are now colonies of other countries. It may also deal with literature written in or by citizens of colonizing countries that takes colonies or their people as its subject matter. We spoke about this a bit ago. The theory is based around concepts of otherness and resistance. Okay, that's not a physics thing. That's not like electricity or whatever it is. That's a non-acceptance of, oh yes, okay, we're all British now, or we're all, you know, whatever. Okay, so post-colonial theory became part of the critical toolbox in the 1970s, says Ruffner. However, let me just find the thing here. It says, Peter Barry, do you remember him from the other videos? Peter Barry says, post-colonial criticism emerged as a distinct category only in the 1990s. So whilst it's been a tool since the 1970s, like it says here in your anthology, it's only been a distinct category since the 1990s. It is not mentioned, for instance, in the first edition of Selden's A Reader's Guide to Contemporary Literary Theory in 1985, or Jeremy Hawthorne's A Concise Glossary of Contemporary Literature in 1992. So it's not even 30 years old yet. I am older than post-colonial. Oh my God, I'm older than post-colonialism. That's really bad. Okay. Oh, wow. It has gained currency through the influence of such books as In Other Worlds, The Empire Writes Back by Bill Ashcroft. I've read that. It's fabulous. Nation and Narration and Cultural and Imperialism by Edward Syed in 1993. An important collection of relevant essays, though it does not use the term post-colonialism, is Race, Writing and Difference in 1986, reprinted from 2 issues of the journal Critical Inquiry and edited by Henry Louis Gates, Jr., one of the best-known American figures in this field. Okay, so P. Barry then continues and says one significant effect of post-colonial criticism is to further undermine the universalist claims once made on behalf of literature by liberal humanist critics. So this is the canon stuff that we were talking about earlier. Not all great literature has got to come from Shakespeare. Not all great literature has got to come from Sophocles or Dickens or people like that, you know. Great literature can come from other places. The whole universal appeal of Shakespeare doesn't necessarily, if you're a post-colonial critic, ring true. Not everybody is going to identify with Romeo, essentially, or not everybody is going to understand. Not everybody's going to understand the nuances in Macbeth because that's not their life experiences. So P. Barry then continues, if we claim that great literature has a timeless and universal significance, we thereby demote or disregard cultural, social, regional, and national differences in experience and outlook, preferring instead to judge all literature by a single supposedly universal standard. We are disregarding everything that makes that writer who they are and that work what it is, because we think everything should be universal, okay? Thus, for instance, a routine claim about the Wessex setting of Hardy's novels is that it is really a canvas on which Hardy depicts and examines fundamental, universal aspects of the human condition. Thus, Hardy's books are not thought of as primarily regional or historical or masculine or white or working class novels. They are just novels. And built into this attitude is the assumption that this way of writing and representing reality is the unquestioned norm, so that the situations depicted can stand for all possible forms of human interaction. But we must know that that's just not true. We can't say that Thomas Hardy is speaking for somebody, I don't know, in Mongolia or in Zimbabwe or in Brazil or anywhere else. Do you know what I mean? So this is what P. Barry is saying. If you're looking at works from a post-colonial perspective, you cannot say that novels are simply there and that they are there for everybody and speak to everybody. We can't say that. That's not, from a post-colonial perspective, you can't say that. Okay? Okay. This universalism is rejected by post-colonial criticism. Whenever a universal signification is claimed for a work, then white, Eurocentric norms and practices are being promoted by a sleight of hand to this elevated status, and all others correspondingly relegated to subsidiary marginalized roles. I can't speak today. The ancestry, he continues, of post-colonial criticism can be traced to Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, published in French in 1961, and voicing what might be called cultural resistance to France's African empire. Because don't forget, the British weren't the only ones with an empire, okay? But in terms of English literature, post-colonial theory is what we look at in terms of the British colonies, okay? Fanon, a psychiatrist from Martinique, argued that the first step for colonized people in finding a voice and an identity is to reclaim their own past. Again, we've seen this in Checking Out My History, haven't we? For centuries, The European colonizing power will have devalued the nation's past, seeing its pre-colonial era as a pre-civilized limbo, or even as a historical void, that there was nothing there to note. Okay. Children, both black and white, will have been taught to see history, culture, and progress as beginning with the arrival of the Europeans. So we've seen this in checking out my history about how they taught them those nursery rhymes. Okay, they tell them about the dish ran away with the spoon, Robin Hood, and all that stuff. Okay, everybody was taught these things, and that's not okay from the post-colonial perspective. Okay. If P. Barry continues, if the first step towards a post-colonial perspective is to reclaim one's own past, then the second is to begin to erode the colonist ideology by which that past has been devalued. Okay, so first you've got to reclaim it, and then the second you've got to erase, almost, post-colonialists say, and P. Barry says, erase what they inflicted. Okay, right, let me swap books again. So here we've got Post-Colonial Theory then became part of the critical toolbox in the 1970s, and many practitioners credit Edward Syed's book Orientalism as being the founding work. Typically, the proponents of theory examine the ways in which writers from colonized countries attempt to articulate and even celebrate their cultural identities and reclaim them from the colonizers. This is just what we've just been saying. This is the same stuff that Peter Barry says. Okay, they also examine ways in which the literature of the colonial powers is used to justify colonialism through the perpetuation of images of the colonized as inferior. That goes back up to the top stuff when we were talking about lesser. Okay, however, attempts at coming up with a single definition of post-colonial theory have proved controversial, and some writers have strongly critiqued the whole concept. Now, let me find my second post-it note, guys, because I wanted to read something else to you as well. So, post-colonial then, this is from the Beginning Post-Colonial book again. Post-colonial, so John McLeod says, it is fair to say that beginning post-colonialism is an especially challenging procedure because it is particularly difficult to answer those questions with which we started, such as the variety of activities often called post-colonial, that it is not very easy to find an appropriate point of departure. For example, the literatures of nations such as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Nigeria, Kenya, India, Pakistan, Jamaica, and Ireland have all been called post-colonial because they were all colonies. Are they all post-colonial in the same way? McLeod asks. That is up for debate because you could argue that somebody's experience in Ireland is much different than that of somebody's experience in Canada or Nigeria or India. Okay. McLeod carries on and he says, what is the best way to begin reading them? Could such a best way of reading ever exist, one that is appropriate to all these literatures? And should we be looking for it? Okay. In addition to readings of post-colonial literatures, sometimes are, in addition, readings of post-colonial literatures sometimes are resourced by concepts taken from many other critical practices, such as post-structuralism, feminism, Marxism, psychoanalysis, and linguistics. Such variety, he says, creates both discord and conflict within the field to the extent that there seems to be no one critical procedure that we might identify as typically post-colonial. So essentially, let me break that down for you. Because there are so many colonies and each had their own experiences and each was subjected to a different way of life, and we can include different sorts of criticism and almost like we're looking at things through a different set of binoculars, then it's really difficult to define what post-colonialism is. This is the struggle with it being pretty new, because don't forget, we had colonies until 70 years ago, give or take, 1952-ish, give or take. Okay, so it's still relatively new. And then we have all these different things, and we've got all these different, it's such a complex thing to look at, because again, we've got so many different perspectives. Okay, so he says then, rather than using an umbrella term that lets in so much, it might be better for us to begin questioning post-colonialism as a meaningful concept and seeking better ways of accounting for its prevailing manifold subject matter and myriad reading strategies. And I'm just going to jump ahead to the next paragraph. He says, for better or worse, the term post-colonialism does have a history. It has entered common parlance and is frequently used by critics, teachers, and writers. It is important that we understand the variety of what the term signifies if we want to begin to use it self-consciously and productively. He then goes on to say there is no one singular post-colonialism, but one of the fundamental arguments of this book that he's writing is that post-colonialism can be articulated in different ways as an enabling concept, despite the difficulties we encounter when trying to define it. So essentially, just because it might be difficult for us doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. It's absolutely vital that we should do it, because do we have the right not to? Do we have the right? Would we be just as guilty as people who colonized in the first place if we continue to ignore and think of their experiences as this historical void? It's not fair, is it? Right, so let me just swap back. Hang on, I'm hanging. Right, okay, so we're on to the next page now. Okay, did I have one more thing to tell you? Let me just check whether I have to read it out now. I think I have to read it out now. Sorry, guys. Be right with you. Right, number 3 then. Oh no, I've done number 3. I'm lying completely. And I've done the second one. No, I haven't done the second one. Sorry, right, number 2. Where's number 2? Okay, right, number 2. We'll go back up here because this is relevant to this bit. I'm so sorry, darling. Right, a good introduction. So Edward Syed then, we've talked about him a couple of times, says a good introduction to issues involved in the identification and study of colonial discourses. That's what you enter into when you read a text. You enter into this discourse. Can be made by considering the following statement by the Trinidadian writer Sam Selvon. If you haven't read The Lonely Londoners, usually I would set this as like an extra reading piece. It is brilliant. It is fantastic. It's a thin book. It's only about 100 pages or so. It is absolutely fantastic. If you can grab a copy, read it. It's brilliant. You'll love Moses. He's fabulous. Okay. At the beginning of his 1979 lecture, 3 into 1 Can't Go, East Indian, Trinidadian, West Indian, Salvon recalls an Indian fisherman who used to visit his street in San Fernando, Trinidad, when he was a child. The fisherman, Sammy, was partly paralyzed and was often a figure of ridicule by the children. One day, Sammy brought a white assistant on his round with him, apparently an escaped convict. Salvon records his utter fury at Sammy for employing the white man as his assistant. This, it seemed to the young Salvon, was not the way life was organised. The white man should be the master, not Sammy. Salvon admits he felt sympathy and dismay for the white assistant, feelings he had never had for the lame Sammy. He uses this anecdote to exemplify how, as a child, he had learned always to regard non-Westerners as inferior. The idea of a white assistant to the Indian Sammy was an affront to his sense of order. This example of the internalizing, this is a technical term, of certain expectations about human relationships speaks volumes about how colonialism operates, as Salvon notes. When one talks of colonial indoctrination, it is usually about oppression or subjugation, or waving little Union Jacks on Empire Day and singing God Save the King. But this gut feeling I had as a child, that an Indian was just a piece of cane trash while the white man was to be honoured and respected, Where had it come from? I don't consciously remember being brainwashed to hold this view either at home or at school. Okay, so when indeed, McLeod asks, Edward Syed says, sorry, I forgot this was an article. Much work has been done in recent years that could provide an answer to Selvon's question. Many writers have striven to demonstrate how colonialism suggests certain ways of seeing specific modes of understanding the world and one's place in it, in that assist in justifying the subservience of colonized peoples to the often assumed superior civilized order of the British colonists. These ways of seeing are at the root of the study of colonial discourses. Now, this bit I've underlined, so it must be important. Colonialism is perpetuated in part by justifying to those in the colonizing nation that the idea that it is right and proper to rule over other peoples, and by getting colonized people to accept their lower ranking in the colonial order of things, a process we can call colonizing the mind. It operates by persuading people to internalize its logic and speak its language, which we've seen in the poems, to perpetuate the values and assumptions of the colonizers as regards the way they perceive and represent the world. Theories of colonial discourses call attention to the role language plays in getting people to succumb to a particular way of seeing that results in the kind of situation Selvon describes. Although the term is often used in the singular, it is much more accurate to talk of colonial discourses rather than colonial discourse, due to its multifarious varieties and operations which differ in time and space. Okay, that was a lot of word language. Essentially, what it's saying is that this doesn't happen overnight. This happens through generations, through generations, through generations and generations, until people just grow up knowing, and I'm going to use that in air quotes, and not that you can see me doing it, but I am, knowing their place. So if you are white, according to post-colonial theory, when there was an empire, you are superior, you are in charge, you are ruling. If you are non-white, you are lesser, you are different, you are subservient, you are there to do whatever you are told. Okay, so this is the issue. So Selvon says, I don't remember being brainwashed, I don't remember being taught, that's just how it was. And when things become how it was, it means that it's happened over so long, it's just part of the way of life. And for some things, that's brilliant, manners, respect, great. But in terms of saying that one group of people is less than the other, this is something, if we've just accepted it, this is something which we then have to challenge, that they have to challenge if they are on the receiving end of it, and we have to challenge if we are giving it out, or they have to challenge if they're giving it out. Okay, so that's essentially what Syed and Selvon are saying. Right, let's get back to the anthology. I think I'm done reading out of books, I think. Okay, right, so what post-colonial critics do, and post-colonial criticism. Okay, this is P. Barry again. We like P. Barry, he's ever so good. Right, so what do? They reject the claims to universalism. So we talked about this earlier. The canon shouldn't just be Western literature exclusively. Great works come from other places. One of my favourite pieces, for example, is Gabriela Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. My university lecturer, Mel, Dr. Ebden, she proclaimed this book. She stood at the front of the lecture hall, held it up and went, "This is the best book ever written." And she wasn't wrong. It is an amazing book. Granted, it falls into the magical realism genre, but there's something of the post-colonial in there as well. And again, I know I'm adding you to your TBR, to be read pile, but if you don't read anything else, you should read that book. It is amazing. Okay, Right, so they look at the idea of this. They reject the claims of the universalism made on behalf of canonical Western literature and seek to show its limitations of outlook, especially its general inability to empathize across the boundaries of cultural and ethnic difference. So it can't empathize with the people it's being talked about because they have no experience of it. Okay. The second one, then, they examine the representation of other cultures in literature as a way of achieving this end. They show, I hate that word, they show how literature is often evasively and crucially silent on matters concerned with colonization and imperialism. For example, the discussion of Jane Austen's Mansfield Park in the example described below. So they foreground questions of cultural difference and diversity and examine their treatment in relevant literary works. They celebrate hybridity and cultural polyvalency, that is, the situation whereby individuals and groups belong simultaneously to more than one culture, for instance, that of the colonizer through a colonial school system, and that of the colonized through local and oral traditions. So think again of checking out my history. I know I'm banging on about this, guys. Sorry about that. But think about checking out my history. Think about everything he was taught in school, yet everything he knew about Mary Sue Cole, about Toussaint, the name I can't say because my French isn't very good, Nanny de Maroon. All of those people he knew about from oral traditions, but he knew about the cow jumped over the moon. He knew about Dick Whittington and his cat. He knew about all this stuff that he was indoctrinated with at school. Okay, so that's what that point is about. Okay, and they develop a perspective not just applicable to post-colonial literatures whereby states of marginality, plurality and perceived otherness are seen as sources of energy and political potential change. So this is positive. Okay, right, so let's have a look at the next bit then. Oops, again, I'm scrolling too far. Right, so post-colonial criticism and example. This is again taken from Beginning Theory, which is a great book. Seriously, guys, it's well worth a look at this, even if you go to the library and borrow it from there. Right. Let us take the essay by Edward Syed on Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, an essay rapidly achieving something of a definitive status and available in Mulhern's contemporary Marxist criticism, in Newton's theory into practice, in Eagleton's Raymond Williams' critical perspectives, and Syed's own culture and imperialism. Under the title Jane Austen and the Empire, Syed carefully foregrounds the background of Austen's novel, which is the estate in Antigua, which Sir Thomas Bertram owns, and through which the estate of Mansfield Park is maintained. The central irony, then, is that the estate in England, which represents an ideal of order and civilization, is sustained by another estate a world away. Much like some of the working environments, the men and the characters in Selvon's book, The Lonely Londoners, that I mentioned before, do. So you absolutely have to read that book. It's amazing. Anyway, carry on. So that Mansfield Park would not have been possible without the slave trade, sugar, and the colonial planter class. Okay, let me scroll down. Mulhern. As Syed remarks, Sir Thomas's property in the Caribbean would have had to be a sugar plantation maintained by slave labour, which wasn't abolished until the 1830s. Syed thus makes the central moral geography of the novel and sees Austen as the start of a line in fiction which leads to Conrad and Kipling, in which the processes of colonization are examined. I'm reading Kipling's Kim at the moment. I'm not very far through, but it is very good. So it's well worth, and this is where it came from. Okay, it's well worth a read. I know. I keep telling you to read like a million books. Sorry about that. Right. So I'm not sorry. You should be reading. Okay. As Mulhern puts it in his introductory note, the consequences The consequence is that the dating of British culture's imperial phase must be revised backwards from the beginning of a formal empire into the 18th century. Thus, Sir Thomas, returning home and rapidly re-establishing order without ever the thought that his views and instincts could be narrow or mistaken, is the quintessential colonizing figure who takes himself as the norm of civilization. He is, says Syed, a Crusoe setting things in order. Nothing prevents our assuming, he says, that he does exactly the same things on a larger scale in Antigua. To hold and rule Mansfield Park is to hold and rule an imperial estate and in association with it. Okay, let's carry on. The reading involves concretizing a dimension of the novel which is largely left implicit. It involves not necessarily arguing that all these things are there in the novel, but that it is the right way to read it. All the same, Syed insists, precisely that these things are there, all these things having to do with the outside brought in, seem to me unmistakably there in the suggestiveness of her elusive and abstract language. So Syed invokes the processes of close reading in his support, for the most part convincingly, but in the end, his appeal seems to be the conscience of the especially white and middle class reader. And he says, this bit here, ooh, I can't highlight properly, sorry guys. We cannot easily say that since Mansfield Park is a novel, its affiliations with a particularly sordid history are irrelevant or transcended, not only because it is irresponsible to say that, but because we know too much to say so without bad faith. It can't be separated, essentially. There is, I think, this is P. Barry, of course, now. There is, I think, no doubt about the effect of reading Syed's essay. Any innocence we might have had about this aspect of the novel goes. It is impossible henceforth to read it without a constant awareness of that absentee settler planter who is at the centre of everything in one sense, and yet constantly withdrawn and marginal in another. Syed's reading likewise locates the centre of the book in an absence, in things unsaid and unspecified. In this sense, it is a form of Marxist criticism influenced by post-structuralist views, contrasting with Krieger's much straighter Marxism. So again, we were talking about this earlier, how these things come from lots of different places and it's not solidified yet, but this is where it's coming from. Okay. It also, like new historicism, comes close to actually naming the details of a specific social colonial situation, the absentee planter landlord class of the 18th century Antigua, rather than just evoking a generalized notion of colonial exploitation. Because we're not writing about Greek mythology here, we are writing about something that actually happened and relatively recently in the grand scheme of things. You can't be general, you can be specific, because stuff like this actually happened. Okay, that's what Barry's saying, and that's what everybody else is saying as well. Okay, right. Colonialist criticism then. Okay, taken from the colonialist criticism. I've scrolled up too far. Sorry, guys. When my first novel was published in 1958, a very unusual review of it was written by a British woman, Honor Tracy, who was perhaps not so much a critic as a literary journalist. But what she said was so intriguing that I have never forgotten it. If I remember rightly, she headlined it, 3 Cheers for Mere Anarchy. The burden of the review itself was as follows. These bright Negro barristers who talk so glibly about African culture, how they would like to return to wearing raffia skirts, how would novelist Ashebe, not sure, like to go back to the mindless times of his grandfather instead of holding the modern job he has in broadcasting in Lagos. I should perhaps point out that the colonialist criticism is not always as crude as this, but the exaggerated grossness of a particular example may sometimes prove useful in studying the anatomy of the species. There are 3 principal parts here. Africa's inglorious past, raffia skirts, to which Europe brings the blessing of civilization, the modern job in Lagos, and for which Africa returns in gratitude, skeptical novels like Things Fall Apart. Before I go on to more advanced varieties, I must give one more example of the same kind of honour as Tracy's, which on account of its recentness, 1970s, this is just 12 years before I was born, actually surprised me. So this again is about all the recent stuff. So yes, it came about in the 70s, it became its own genre, an own distinct category in the 90s. So 1970 is 50 years old. That's it, just 50 years old. Okay. I think Bohemian Rhapsody, the song Bohemian Rhapsody, is older than this. Okay. Right. The British administration not only safeguard women from the worst tyrannies of their masters, it also safeguarded women, sorry, past tense, from the worst tyrannies of their masters. It also enabled them to make their long journeys to farm or market without armed guard, secure from the menace of hostile neighbours. The Nigerian novelists who have written the charming and bucolic accounts of domestic harmony in African rural communities are the sons whom the labourers of these women educated. The peaceful village of their childhood, to which they nostalgically look back, was one which had been purged of bloodshed and alcoholism by an azure-ridden district officer and a Scottish mission lassie whose years were cut short by every kind of an intestinal parasite. It is even... Oh, I've scrolled too far. Sorry, guys. It is even true to say that one of the most nostalgically convincing of the rural African novelists used as... that one of the most nostalgic convincing of the rural African novelist used as his source book, not the memories of his grandfathers, but the records of the despised British anthropologists. Sorry guys, I got confused there. The modern African mythmaker hands down a vision of colonial rule in which the native powers are chivalrously viewed through the eyes of the hard-worn liberal tradition of the late Victorian scholar, while the expatriates are shown as schoolboys, blackboard and caricatures. Okay, that was Andreski. I've scrolled down too far again. God, sorry. Okay, we're here now. I have quoted this at such length because, first of all, I am intrigued by Iris Andreski's literary style, which recalls so faithfully the sedate prose of the district officer government anthropologist of 60 or 70 years ago, a tribute to her remarkable powers of identification, as well as to the durability of colonialist rhetoric. Tyrannies of their masters, menace of hostile neighbours, purge bloodshed and alcoholism. But in addition to this, Iris Andreski advances the position taken by Honor Tracy in one significant and crucial director, its claim to a deeper knowledge and more reliable appraisal of Africa than the educated African writer has shown himself capable of. To the colonist mind, it was always of the utmost importance to be able to say, I know my natives, a claim which implied two things at once. A, that the native was really quite simple, and B, that understanding him and controlling him went hand in hand, understanding being a precondition for control, and control constituting adequate proof of understanding. Thus, in the heyday of colonialism, any serious incident of native unrest, carrying as it did disquieting imitations of slipping control, was on occasion not only for pacification by the soldiers, but also, afterwards, for a royal commission of inquiry, a grand name for yet another perfunctory study of native psychology and institutions. Meanwhile, a new situation was slowly developing as a handful of natives began to acquire a European education, and then to challenge Europe's presence and position in their native land with the intellectual weapons of Europe itself. This is related to cultural cringe. Okay, that's a term that you'll have to look at if you are writing about a post-colonial book. This is a term you're going to have to look up, and you're going to have to research cultural cringe. Okay, to deal with this phenomenal presumption of the colonists devised two contradictory arguments. He created the man of two worlds theory to prove that no matter how much the native was exposed to European influences, he could never truly absorb them. Okay, like Prester John, he would always discard the mask of civilization when the crucial hour came and reveal his true face. Now, did this mean that the educated native was no different at all from his brothers in the bush? Oh no, he was different. He was worse. His abortive effort at education and culture, though leaving him totally unredeemed and renegated, had nonetheless done something to him. It had deprived him of his links with his own people, whom he no longer even understood, and who certainly wanted none of his dissatisfaction or pretensions. I know my natives. They are delighted with the way things are. It is only these half-educated ruffians who don't even know their own people. How often one heard that and the many variation of it in colonial times. And how almost amusing to find its legacy in the colonialist criticism of our literature today. Iris Andreski's book is more than old wives' tales, at least in intention. I think I need to scroll down a bit. Sorry, guys. There we are. We're there. Okay. It is clearly inspired by the desire to undercut the educated African witness, the modern myth taker, she calls him, by appealing direct to the unspoilt woman of the bush who has retained a healthy gratitude for Europe's intervention in Africa. This desire accounts for all that reliance one finds in modern European travellers' tales on the evidence of simple natives, houseboys, cooks, drivers, schoolchildren, supposedly more trustworthy than the smart ones. This is all about how people, if they became educated in the European way, they were then disliked even more than those who weren't. Okay, so language then, right at the very bottom. This is probably something that you're going to need to pay attention to if you are analysing a book in the post-colonial genre. So it says language then. This is from B. Ashcroft, G. Griffiths and H. Tiffin, which just, they're brilliant, what brilliant sounding names they are. Okay, anyway, language is a fundamental site of struggle for post-colonial discourse because the colonial process itself begins with language. So we're looking at things being written in a dialect. So again, we're looking at checking out my history, and if you read The Lonely Londoners, all of that is written in a dialect as well. The control over language by the empirical centre, whether achieved by displacing native languages, by installing itself as standard against other variants which are constituted as impurities, or by planting the language of empire in a new place, remains the most potent instrument of cultural control. Language provides the terms by which reality may be constituted. It provides the names by which the world may be known. So we don't know what a table is until somebody points at it and says, table. Okay? So essentially, if you can impose your language on another group of peoples, then you know you're halfway towards colonizing them, according to this. Especially if you write off their language as something else, something worse, you know. Okay. Its system of values, its suppositions, its geography, its concepts of history, of difference, its myriad gradations, gradations of distinction, becomes the system upon which social, economic, and political discourses are grounded. Language controls everything, essentially. One of the most subtle demonstrations of the power of language is the means by which it provides, through the function of naming, a technique for knowing a colonized place or people. To name the world is to understand it, to know it and have control over it. The word Africa, for instance, is determined by European historical formations which had little or no relevance to the complex of linguistic, cultural, and economic factors which tied and sometimes separated various societies on the continent. Okay? To name reality is therefore to exert power over it, simply because the dominant language becomes the way in which it is known. In colonial experience, this power is by no means vague or abstract. A systematic education and indoctrination installed the language and thus the reality on which it was predicated as preeminent. So if they have to speak in disjointed English, does that then separate them and make them more lonely, for example? You'll see this in The Lonely Londoners if you read it, because you should, because it's ace. Right, that's my question if you read it, if you read The Lonely Londoners. All right, language then and transformation. This is from Ashcroft, Griffiths and Tiffin again. They're very popular. Okay, post-colonial writers who write in English have used it as a cultural vehicle through which a world audience could be introduced to features of culturally diverse post-colonial societies. Because if they were to write it in their own languages, people who only speak English, and let's face it, there are plenty of them, wouldn't pick it up. They wouldn't be aware of the struggles. If Checking Out My History had been written in a different language, you guys would never have even attempted to read it because you didn't know anything about it. You wouldn't have been able to read a word of it. Okay, so by writing in English, you are you are both still subject to the colonizing language and yet using it as a tool to get out your message to people who are doing the colonizing. I hope that makes sense. So it says then, but the use of colonial languages has opened up a long-running and unresolved argument in post-colonial circles. According to Indian linguist Braj Karachu, I can't pronounce his name. I'm so sorry. That's so ignorant of me. English has been widely accepted as a lingua franca in India because of its relatively neutral nature, since its effects in everyday use are far less inflammatory than those stemming from the contention between one or another of the minority languages. On the other hand, the Kenyan novelist Thiongo has argued, and I've read some of Thiongo's stuff, it's fantastic, has argued that writing in an African language is part and parcel of the anti-imperialist struggles of the Kenyan and African peoples. Okay, so let's carry on a little bit. Scroll down before I forget, and I've done it again. I've gone too far. Underlying the dispute over the most effective form of discursive resistance is the question: can one use the language of imperialism without being inescapably contaminated by an imperial world view? Can you purely use English as a tool rather than have to accept or everything that comes with it, the culture, the belief system, the structure, the values? Can you use it just as a tool to convey your own message to the people who are oppressing you? This is the question. It is a question, where am I? It is a question which continues to provoke argument because it is ineluctably, I can't say that word, ineluctably rooted in real political conflict. I really can't say that word. Okay, for instance, we've got Glissant here saying there are no languages or language spoken in Martinique, neither Creole nor French, that have been naturally developed by and for us Martinicans. I don't know what the plural of Martinique is. Martinicans, we'll say that. Because of our experience of collective, proclaimed, denied, or seized responsibility at all levels. The official language, French, is not the people's language. This is why we, the elite, speak it so correctly. The language of the people, Creole, is not the language of the nation. Okay, language is key here. Okay, although, let me scroll down or I'll just forget. Although framed in terms of class, Glissant's observations, which, I mean, if you're talking about colonizing, class is often a key theme, you know. So if you are writing a book about this, then it might be something that's there that you can discuss. Okay, where was I? Glissant's observation alerts us to the frequency with which a particular use of language can be conflated with the language itself. What makes a language a people's language? Does it lie in the fact of its origin, its invention, or in the particular conditions of its use? The extent to which either French or Creole will be the language of the people depends largely on how it is used, as much upon how widely it is used and by whom. So is this the same with English then, perhaps? Perhaps. So that's up to you to decide. Okay, language and spirit then, guys, and we are a page or so from the end, so woohoo. Okay, language and spirit, this is taken by Rao. This is from the actual book. Yeah, okay, never mind. There is no village in India, however mean, that has not a rich Slatha Purana or a legendary history of its own. Some god or godlike hero has passed by the village. Rama might have rested under this pipal tree. Sita might have dried her clothes after her bath on this yellow stone. Or the Mahatma himself, on one of his many pilgrimages throughout the country, might have slept in this hut, the low one, by the village gate. In this way, the past mingles with the present, and the gods mingle with men to make the repertory of your grandmother always bright. One such story from contemporary annals of a village I have tried to tell. The telling has not been easy. One has to convey in a language that is not one's own the spirit that is not one's own. One has to convey the various shades and emissions of a certain thought movement that looks maltreated in an alien language. I use the word alien, yet English is not really an alien language to us. It is the language of our intellectual makeup, like Sanskrit or Persian was before, but not of our emotional makeup. So there are two different sorts of languages depending on what the requirement is. Okay, we are all instinctively bilingual, many of us writing on our own language and in our own language and in English. We cannot write like the English. We should not. So perhaps this is why people write in dialects then. Okay, that's something for you to consider if your novel happens to have that in it. We cannot write only as Indians. We have grown to look at the large world as part of us. Our method of expression, therefore, has to be a dialect which will someday prove to be as distinctive and colourful as the Irish or the American. Time alone will justify it. So maybe then all it takes is for these languages to develop is time, is for people to use it generation after generation after generation. Perhaps. This is something that if you are writing a book that concerns stuff like this, perhaps that's something that you can discuss if that appears in your book, if there are hints towards it. Okay, scroll down a bit. After language, the next problem is that of style. The tempo of Indian life must be infused into our English expression, even as the tempo of American or Irish life has gone into the making of theirs. We in India think quickly, we talk quickly, and when we move quickly. There must be something in the sun of India that makes us rush and tumble and run on, and our paths are interminable. Okay? So the Mahabharata, and I hope I'm saying that properly, has 214,778 verses, and the Ramayana 48,000. The Puranas are endless and innumerable. We have neither punctuation nor the treacherous ats and ons to bother us, those prepositions. We tell one interminable tale. Episode follows episode, and when our thought stops, our breath stops, and we move on to another thought. This was and still is the ordinary style of our storytelling. I have tried to follow it myself in this story. Squidge down a bit. It may have been told of an evening, whereas the dusk falls, and through the sudden quiet, lights leap up into the house after house, and stretching her bedding on the veranda, a grandmother might have told you, newcomer, the sad tale of her village. Okay, so that's talking about how we might need language to be used over a couple of generations, perhaps, for it to be, widely used and viewed as more typical. I won't say normal, but typical, perhaps. Okay. Post-colonialism then and gender. This is from The Invention of Women, making an African sense of Western gender discourses. Okay, so we are a page and a half away. So the histories of both the colonized and the colonizer have been written from the male point of view. Women are peripheral if they appear at all. While studies of colonization written from this angle are not necessarily irrelevant to understanding what happened to native females, we must recognize that colonization impacted males and females in similar and dissimilar ways. Colonial custom and practice stemmed from a worldview which believes in the absolute superiority of the human over the non-human and the subhuman, the masculine over the feminine, and the modern or progressive over the traditional or the savage. That was from Nandi in 1983, which is a year younger than me. I'm so old. Therefore, the colonizer differentiated between male and female bodies and acted accordingly. Men were the primary target of policy, and, as such, they were the natives and so were visible. These facts, from the standpoint of this study, are the justification for considering the colonial impact in gendered terms rather than attempting to see which group, male or female, was the most exploited. The colonial process was sex differentiated insofar as the colonizers were male and used gender identity to determine policy. From the foregoing, it is clear that any discussion of hierarchy in the colonial situation, in addition to employing race as the basis of distinctions, should take into account its strong gender component. The two racially distinct and hierarchical categories of the colonizer and the native should be expanded to four, incorporating the gender factor. However, race and gender categories obviously emanate from the preoccupation in the Western culture with the visual and hence physical aspects of human reality. Both categories are Both categories are a consequence of the biologic of Western culture. Thus, in the colonial situation, there was a hierarchy of four, not two categories. Beginning at the top, these were men European, women European, native African men, and other African women. Native women occupy the residual and unspecified category of the other. Remember at the beginning we talked about othering? This is this is saying it's even worse for women who happen to be native. Essentially, that were the bottom of the hierarchy. Okay, so if your text deals with something like that, that is an extra thing for you to consider when you are writing your essay. So, cultural reading and understanding, and this is the last section, darling, so we're almost there. This is a long video. I appreciate that it's already over an hour, but I promise it's worth it. And the bonus of this video is that you can come back to it if you get stuck. You can fast forward and rewind. So this is taken from from Heroic Ethnocentrism, the idea of universality in literature by C. Lawson. I haven't read this book, but I really should. So in the fall of 1962, so fall there means autumn. In the fall of 1962, when I began teaching English literature to high school students in Nigeria, I encountered a number of stumbling blocks, which I had in no way anticipated, all of them cultural, experiential. Okay, I can't speak today. I really can't. Has anybody seen my teeth? Blech. Okay, this was not a matter of science or technology and their various byproducts as I had anticipated, what is a flush toilet, for example, but rather matters related to what I have learned to call culturally restricted materials. It was enough, to be sure, just for my African students to read through a 450-page Victorian novel, required reading in those days for the British-administered School of Certificate examinations. So 450 pages, even for you guys, is tough. Imagine what it'd be like for somebody whose first language wasn't Victorian English. It would be like trying to read Martian or something. So where am I? And where am I? And as later, okay. And as I later learned, in the lower levels at least, students were accustomed to taking several months or even the greater part of a year to read through and discuss the plotline of a single novel. Length alone was enough to get them, since English was their second language and the problem of vocabulary was especially troublesome. But once the problems of language, vocabulary, and verbosity had been overcome, reading through the words became a less difficult process than understanding what the words themselves related, the experience of literature, as we are wont to say. So there is a difference between reading and understanding. You guys know this. You might be able to read a word, but you might not know what it means. So imagine you are a child in Nigeria. You have been given a 450-page book in Victorian English to read. You might be able to identify the words, but understanding what it means might be will probably be an entirely different kettle of fish. So, we carry on then. Lawson carries on. Excuse me, sir, what does it mean to kiss? That was a much more difficult question to answer than the usual ones relating to the plot or the characters of the novel. A real shock when it was brought to my attention that I had a rather naive boy in my class. So I brushed the question off until it was repeated a number of times, and I slowly began to realize that all of my students had no real idea of what it meant to kiss. This seemed an extremely odd thing to me because most of my students were upper form boys in their late teens, some in their early 20s, and I had, of course, heard them talking on occasion about their girlfriends. It was also rumoured that several of the boys were married, although by school regulations they were not supposed to be. Nevertheless, that question, and others of a like nature, kept recurring, in part, no doubt, because we were reading Thomas Hardy's Far from the Madding Crowd. Why did Hardy's characters get so flustered when they were kissed, or more likely when they weren't kissed? When I asked one of the European educated African teachers why my students always seemed ready to return to that same question, I was more than surprised to learn that Africans traditionally, at least, do not kiss. To learn that what I thought was natural in one society is not natural at all, but learned, that is, cultural. Not all peoples kiss. Or, stated more appropriately, not all peoples have learned to kiss. When I later attended American movies with Africans, I could understand why the audience often went into hysterics at the romantic scenes in the film. So Lawson then understood that maybe there would be issues about a flushing toilet, like in Nigeria, there might be massive differences in technology, maybe some cultural stuff, but something is, for him, natural and ubiquitous as this physical act to not exist was a massive shock. Okay, so no wonder they didn't know what it meant. Okay, right, so I've gone too far again. How was one to read a Thomas Hardy novel with all those frustrated kisses without ever having been kissed? How was I to explain something like this to my African students? Or to limit my experience to a more technical matter concerning the novel's form, which also perplexed my students? What about those long passages of description for which Hardy is so celebrated? My African students couldn't understand what page after page of description of the countryside had to do with the plot of the novel. What they had given me, as I later learned, was another clue into the differing ways in which culture shapes our interpretations of literature. It was not until I seriously began studying the African novel itself, however, that I could put all of those pieces together, just as the questions about those kisses revealed something about my African students' cultural background, so too did their concern about the descriptive passages of Hardy's book. The fact that descriptive passages were virtually non-existent in African fiction initially seemed partially puzzling to me, since the first generation of African Anglophone novelists, at least, had been brought up almost entirely on the Victorian novel, whereas other elements of the Victorian novel had found their way into the African novel. Description had not. So you guys know, you've read Dickens, you know about the description of London, the fog, the gloom. There are lengthy paragraphs about stuff like this, and this is considered brilliant writing if you can do it well, but not for African novels. Despite the fact that they were educated using these examples, it's not for them. They came up with something else. Okay, they didn't. Description wasn't included. Could it be that this omission in the African novel revealed something basically different between African and Western attitudes towards nature, to one's environment. Kissing and description, attitudes towards love and nature. Are these attitudes so different for the African? Is the African way of life less sophisticated than our own? Or is it the belief that these supposedly universal attitudes should be the same as ours, the naive one? Is this what we really mean when we talk about universality in literature? If someone does not react to something in our literature the same way that we do, then he is to be considered inferior? Perhaps the term itself is meaningless. After all, people love and die in every culture. Their reactions to these events in their lives, however, may be significantly different from our own. And these reactions, and Diefenbaker agrees, and these reactions in turn shape their interpretations of literature. Right, that was a big, long video, guys. I hope there was something in there that helped you understand this section more. I hope that you've got ideas. Shush, Diefenbaker. Sorry, he's got stuff to say. I hope this helps you with ideas about what you want to include in your essay, what things you've seen in the book that you're reading, and what things you could be discussing about for your question. As always, you can tweet me if you've got any issues. You can email me. You know where I am, at Miss Hine English. You can send me an email. Or now that we're back at school, you can pop in during a lunchtime and come and ask me a couple of questions. Okay? Work hard, and I'll see you soon. Like and subscribe. Jokes. Obs.